Hi everyone, this is Jeff Wilson and I'm with Go Security Pro. Let's talk about access control. So a little bit about us. We're an Oklahoma City based cybersecurity firm, and what's a little different about our approach is that we use data breach analytics. We study data breaches so that we understand how organizations like yours are getting hacked and figuring out, okay, what are the root causes, what are the key decision points that organizations can make to stop and prevent breaches. And then we help organizations build cybersecurity plans that are right-sized for their business. I've been in the information security space for 15 years, a consultant for the last 7. I was a professor at OU, taught information security graduate level course. I have a master's from Carnegie Mellon in cybersecurity, bachelor's in computer science from OU, and worked at the NSA. And I just live and breathe cybersecurity, and it's a hard problem. Sure, that's no surprise to anybody watching this. And access control specifically is a large topic. You can go a lot of ways with this. So what I'm going to do is focus on kind of our unique take on this is how do we stop breaches using access control? What are those key access control points that organizations really need to look at? Because access control is everywhere. It can get overwhelming if you try to look at the whole thing. So back in late 2019, we published a report that for the healthcare space specifically. But the challenges in healthcare are not unlike the challenges in other industries. And in fact, they're very, you can see these top 6 OCR cited technical security controls. And what we did was we looked at, because healthcare is a unique space where if there's a data breach, organizations are required to report that to OCR. And so we looked at that data. OCR provides that data, but it's raw data, right? You have to make sense of it. So we spent a lot of time making sense of that data, and we came up with the 6 top controls that they cite as being breach prevention controls. The first, so we're going to talk about a couple of these, right? Multi-factor authentication. So I was doing a penetration test for an electric company, and through a website vulnerability was able to get passwords to their internet-facing web application. It was an outage management system. It had the ability to do push notifications to all their customers, any message you want. So, and this was it had a weakness. It was exposing a whole directory of logs, and in those logs, it was logging things like usernames and passwords, which is not good, right? And what I was able to do was then find the application administrator's credentials in these web logs, and these web logs weren't cached by Google. They weren't referenced to by the web server. You had to know where to look, and so that's why they hadn't been hit by this before, because nobody had looked there until I started testing. And so pretty soon I was able to, get administrative access over that application. And then it turns out I was able to get access to their internal network because that application was configured with domain credentials to be able to send out email notifications. And so there was an Outlook service account that was actually a domain user account. So then I was able to just log into the remote desktop gateway and be inside the network. So multi-factor authentication is crucial these days, and it would have prevented that whole scenario, because first, you have to look at what's remotely accessible. So with multi-factor authentication, it's really important to have that protecting remote access. So things like cloud-hosted web applications, the web applications that you're hosting, remote, VPN, remote access, remote desktop, all of those remote access methods need to have multi-factor authentication. It's almost becoming best practice at this point. It is best practice, in fact. But then also think about multi-factor authentication from standard user accounts to privileged user accounts. So maybe if your high privileged IT administrators need to log in with their domain administrator credentials or a highly privileged account, perhaps that needs to have multi-factor authentication on it as well. Or maybe logging into any servers, right? That's another way to tackle that. So multi-factor authentication, definitely huge these days. And with things like Office 365, it's baked in. It's just an option you can turn on. You know, with your VPN, remote access, with your cloud-hosted applications, it all depends on the software and the systems you have in place. If it's an add-on service or if it's part of what, you know, if it's already baked in. I'm also going to talk about number 5. So remote access security is huge. I was working with a healthcare company after they got breached. They brought us in, and it turned out the bad actors were able to gain access to their, they were through the remote VPN, through their VPN server. And what we found out after investigating is that this entity had 6 remote access solutions in place. Every vendor that came along, so they had a managed IT provider. They had a remote access solution that they used. They had an application over here that was managed by another third party, and they had their own remote access. Then the internal IT person had their remote. There was just way too many remote access technologies, and so in that scenario, they weren't able to centrally control that, log it, monitor it, because it was just a free-for-all, right? So think about your remote access. How do you remotely access your network? And you should have a secure design where, you know, you don't implement 6 different ways to get in, right? It should be a very limited number, 1 preferably, ways to get in. And then think about your cloud-hosted applications as well. That's a remote access point. And yeah, so again, going back to multi-factor authentication on that. So simplifying remote access so that you can centrally control it and manage it is crucial. Let's look at number 4, disable email forwarding. This is one that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but in fact, it's the 4th sided control by OCR. Encryption, that makes sense. Password security makes sense, but disable email forwarding, why is that important? So I see a lot of cases where like somebody in HR or accounting or finance will be hit, their email becomes compromised maybe through phishing or some other threat vector. And then what the attacker does is they turn on forwarding of the email to the attacker so that any email coming into that victim gets auto-forwarded to the attacker. And this allows the attacker to sit back, watch these emails go by, and wait for some point in time at which to inject, go back in and make something happen. So like they'll wait for an invoice to go through, and then the attacker will log in and say, oops, I sent you the wrong invoice. Here's the updated one with the correct account number, something like that. And of course, then that account number is the attacker's, overseas account, and your money's gone. So email forwarding is a crucial control. If you're in Office 365 or even Exchange, make sure that your email users are unable to turn on forwarding. There's very few reasons why you would need to forward all of your email to an external email account, because that could, email by default is not encrypted, so that could expose sensitive information over the network just in itself. But then also now you've got all of this data being sent, and it could be to an attacker's email address. So those are some of the big issues here. Let's talk about fundamental cybersecurity ingredients. So these are the concepts that permeate everything we do as cybersecurity practitioners. Defense in depth, definitely a big one. Attack surface minimization, and least privilege. So the one here that screams access control to me is least privilege. So let's look at that real quick. And I equate it to a valet key. When you go and you do a valet parking deal, and you have this valet key, the reason you would give that valet key to a valet is because the valet only needs permission to park the car. They don't need access to your glove box or your trunk. And usually the valet key cannot open the glove box or the trunk. So you could put in your valuables, and so it's least privilege. Only give the valet what they need access to do. Same thing goes from a cybersecurity perspective. And usually when people hear least privilege, they think of, oh, you're wanting to take away my administrator privileges, so now I can't install software on my system and all that. But yes, that's part of it, right? But it's so much more. Least privilege is in so many places that often gets forgotten. So here is this is kind of a busy graphic, and you don't have to understand all this, but there's a lot going on here. What this is how when we analyze for a company, okay, what protections do you have in place for ransomware specifically? Let's say we're looking at that scenario. I have a check next to all the controls where they have in place and that are working well. The things that are open boxes that are colored are things that we could do next. And what I've done is I've plotted this against two mental models. The first is those foundational cybersecurity concepts and the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is the cybersecurity framework. So plotting all of these controls out, what I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that the very dark green color, there's one box here, and that is a low impact activity, high effort. And that is configuring users not to run as admin. So if you are worried about ransomware and you're spending all of your time trying to take away admin privileges from users, you're spending it on the wrong project. Here's why. 80% of ransomware doesn't need admin privileges to work. All it needs access to is the data to encrypt it. It doesn't have to necessarily have full access to the system. So if you're thinking about specifically ransomware, what are we going to tackle? Maybe the things in dark red, and this is an example scenario for this specific company, but this is a way to think about those activities. Make sure you're focusing on the right priorities. So with least privilege, yes, it's configuring users not to run as admin, but it's also so much more. It's domain administrator privilege. So I was once on a pen test where I had gotten control of a printer, and it had authentication disabled or something like that. And usually printers are the last thing people think about from a cybersecurity perspective. It's like, well, it's a printer, what's the risk, right? And so what happened in this scenario was at the printer, you could go up to it and start typing in somebody's name, and it would autofill with, okay, you want to send this to joe@company.com, right? And then you could automatically send it via email to that individual. And so this printer was integrated with LDAP. And this printer interface had a vulnerability where it exposed the user's credentials in the source code of the website. So if you looked at it on the web screen, it would have the dots for the password, right? But if you looked at the source behind it, it was in clear text. And so you just look at the source and, oh, there's the password to the LDAP server. This is how the printer is logging in and getting that information from the LDAP server. But what it was is somebody had configured the domain administrator account to be doing that function. So I was able to go from zero access, only internal network access, to domain administrator access via a printer exploit. So you have to be really careful. The lesson here is be really careful with what you do with your domain administrator privileges. Service account lease privilege. So, again, I was talking about the electric company that I compromised through an Outlook user that was, an Outlook service account on an external web app that had the ability to log into the domain. And again, that's not least privilege. We need to think about how, what is the absolute least privilege that account needs to have. And then I see a lot of companies that are running, let's say, backup exec or some other service account, a service on every system in their environment, and they've configured that to be a domain with domain administrator privileges. Yes, it's easy to get it set up and running. Yes, it'll work, but it's highly insecure because now you have those domain administrator tokens, those all over your environment. So now if I compromise one system from a local administrator perspective, I can instantly escalate to domain admin, which gives me full control of your environment. So Really, domain administrator privileges should only be used for managing domain controllers. If you're going to log into workstations throughout your environment, use a local admin account. We need to stop spraying the domain administrator account to all these systems. So what I would challenge you to do is go back and look at your domain administrators group in Active Directory and see what is a member of that. Those, you shouldn't really see service accounts in there. If you do, that's a problem. You shouldn't really see a bunch of accounts that you have no idea what they are. It should be limited to just those highly trusted, highly privileged IT managers and administrators to be able to do their job, right? Okay. Data backups lease privilege. I had a client I was working with who was hit by ransomware, and they had backups. They had great backups. The problem was the backups were accessible to the ransomware, and the backups were encrypted. So now they couldn't get back their data, and they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay the ransom to get their data back. It was crucial to the business. They made that decision, risk-based. But think about segmenting your backups off from the rest of your network, because those are crucial to restoring your environment. So you want to make sure not that very few access points to those data backups. Network share lease privilege. This is another one that can really help mitigate things like ransomware, where if everyone has access to everything on the network file share, now if one system's compromised, your whole file share is compromised, right? Does accounting really need access to all of engineering's documents, right? So think about what are those, how can you segment those and make sure you have least privilege on those network shares so that accounting just has access to accounting stuff and engineering just has access to engineering stuff. And well, if engineering and accounting need access to the same stuff, maybe it's in a third location that is only things that they both need access to. So concepts like that. And also, this electric company that I compromised was able to get into their network. I was able to browse open file shares and find over 300,000 customer records just in open file shares. Companies struggle with identifying what's on their open file shares, what can anyone on the network get to, and making sure that that's just open information that anybody should have access to. Your most critical data should be highly protected and should limit the access to it. All right, so we talked about least privilege. Let's now shift over to attack surface minimization. And usually you think about attack surface minimization, you think about, okay, let's harden our firewall, our external firewall, to make sure people can't get into our environment. Yes, that's important, but it also needs to be so much more. For instance, if you have a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, where you have servers that are accessible to the internet, you should buffer those off from the rest of your internal network because those are at a higher risk posture, right? And so best practice here is to make sure that the DMZ cannot reach into the internal network and access all your internal network resources. So I'm helping a company through an incident right now where they got hit with ransomware. There was a SQL server on their DMZ, which in itself is a problem, but there was an RDP port open to the internet, remote desktop. There are various exploits out there right now like Eternal Blue and Bluekeep. This one was an Eternal Blue exploit that hadn't patched the system since 2015. So it was only a matter of time before this were to happen. So the attackers gained full control over the SQL server, and then because the DMZ had full access to the internal network, they were able to then encrypt all the systems on the network. In fact, they got to about a third of them before it was stopped. But still, we need to think about limiting what systems on a lower trust network like the DMZ can access on a network of higher trust. So here's another example. Not just the DMZ, but think about your regular user networks where workstations are, printers, all that stuff. And then think about your server network. The server network should be higher trust. The user network is inherently lower trust because you have people browsing the internet, email, and all that, right? It's a higher exposure there. You shouldn't really be browsing the internet from a server or doing email from servers, right? So think about putting segmentation between user networks and server networks so that if a user system becomes compromised, now that system can't be used to attack servers. Here is one case where access control, network access control, really worked. So I was doing a pen test for a different electric company, and I exploited a printer, but I couldn't get that clear text password thing that I could get on the other one. But I could change its LDAP settings. So what I wanted to do was trick the printer into thinking I was the LDAP server, and stand up a rogue LDAP server, and then have that printer talk to my LDAP server and expose the credentials that it had stored for LDAP, right? And so I did that. I set up a rogue LDAP server, changed the configuration on the printer to point to me, and it didn't work because that company had implemented network access control that said LDAP shouldn't be allowed to any other network except for where our LDAP server is. And so they had these, between VLANs, they had all these blocking rules that really were super effective. So thinking about how you can isolate and ask yourself, okay, for this one service, where does that traffic need to flow? And then limiting what it can do, and putting in rules to enforce that. So that was a case where network access control really worked for a company, and it prevented an exploit potentially of a service account for LDAP. So in summary, think about this. Think about severely limiting the use of domain admin privileges. Figure out where your IT managers, sysadmins are using those. Make sure, definitely don't want to be browsing the internet, doing your regular day-to-day stuff as a privileged user, as a domain admin. You should only be using domain admin to log into domain controllers to do domain management. But if you're doing systems management, if you're logging into workstations, let's use local administrator accounts. That's sufficient, but it doesn't put those domain admin credentials and tokens at risk. Isolate data backups. Make sure you've got those. Even offline works well, right? If you've got tape backups or something like that, you can send them offline. Just make sure that you can't reach them from your regular network, right? Make sure that there's a path that is very well defined and very few cases where that can be accessed. Implement least privilege on network file shares. So this is looking at what do you have exposed in open file shares. Does anybody in your company, do people have access to data they shouldn't have, between departments and things like that? And then looking at how you do access control from a network perspective, segmenting low trust zones like your DMZ from your high trust zones, internal network, making sure that because your DMZ is at a higher chance of compromise, make sure that those systems can't be used to reach into the network and compromise other things. And then ensure your priorities align with your actual risk. Too many times I see companies that are focusing on project A, project B, where actually project C and D are their highest risk areas. I'll see companies, working on getting penetration tests, but they haven't even done security awareness yet for their employees, or they're doing phishing tests, but they haven't even trained their employees on how to recognize phishing. So make sure your priorities are right. Make sure you have a plan and it's risk aligned. So thank you so much for watching this. Again, I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. We love referrals, so if you know of anybody who needs cybersecurity consultation, we'd love to talk to them. Again, we're OKC based. And if you want to and follow us, if you want to hear about some of the cool things, we put out videos like this periodically. You can check us out on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. But thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a healthy and good rest of your day and the weeks ahead. Thank you, and have a good one.